Unleashed Gaming here with my TBC tank breakdown covering the Warrior, Druid, and Paladin. An important caveat before we get started, all tanks in TBC are viable for all content. There are specific mechanics and encounters where one tank may be more optimal than another, but there is nothing stopping your guild from running any combination of these three tanks and beating the entire game. That being said, in this video we are going to cover how these tanks are different, where and when they are strongest, and give you a good idea of the capabilities of each tank when you are looking at the mechanics and your raid roster and trying to make assignments. So, without further ado, let's get started. Having a large HP pool is very important for a tank and is a result of two factors, your base HP and your percent bonus scaling from stamina. The Paladin has 4.4k base HP, the Warrior 5.9k, and the Bearform Druid 4.7k. As far as talents go, the Paladin has Sacred Duty and Combat Expertise, granting them a total of 16% bonus stamina. The Warrior has Vitality, which grants them 5% bonus stamina. And lastly, the Bear Druid has 25% bonus stamina and an additional 3% from talents. What does this mean? This means the Warrior will have the initially highest HP, but will be passed fairly quickly by the Druid, who will have the highest HP total for the rest of the expansion. The Paladin will start lower than the other tanks, and will take longer to eventually reach parity and potentially exceed the Warrior in very, very late game content. In addition to having a large HP pool, tanks also need to reduce the damage they take. This comes in the forms of armor and percent reduction. A Warrior will have between 53 and 65% physical damage reduction from armor, 10% damage reduction from defensive stance, and 6% spell damage mitigation from talents. A Paladin will have between 53 and 65% physical damage reduction from armor, 6% damage reduction from talents, 4% spell damage reduction from talents, and a conditional 30% damage reduction below 35% HP. A Druid will have between 65 and 74% physical damage reduction from armor. This can get up to 75%, which is the armor cap. And to illustrate how good this is, if you take a 1000 damage hit and you mitigate 75% of it, you take 250 damage. If that same hit you take 65% reduced damage, or 350, you're actually taking closer to 30% more damage than the 75% mitigation tank. So even though it only says 10% difference, it's actually a significantly reduced damage that you are taking as a result of having high armor. However, there is one additional form of armor, which is block. It's kind of a pseudo armor. It's a flat value on every time you block. Warrior and Paladins can ensure that they block pretty much every hit, and they will have a shield block value of between 150 to 400 barring trinkets and tier set bonuses. The harder the mob hits, the less of a percent reduction this is into damage taken. So this is part of the reason why Paladins are quite good at trash mob tanking, because they can guarantee a more significant damage reduction on lots of fast hitting small mobs than they can on a large slow hitting boss. Even with a lot of armor and HP, you will still die if the boss crits you. Crits deal double damage and are reduced by defense rating, resilience, and talents. Resilience is usually less expensive, a stat on gear, but defense will also grant parry, block, and dodge. The amount of defense required by each class is 490 defense, or 221 resilience for Warriors and Paladins, or 415 defense, or 103 resilience for Druids. Druids are a special case in that they get the most out of resilience. As they do not gain, block, and parry from defense, it becomes less efficient. Therefore, the lower cost of resilience becomes much more attractive for reaching crit immunity. The other major way of reducing boss damage is to become uncrushable. Bosses have a 15% chance to crush a player and deal 150% of their normal damage. Your defense rating has no effect on this, unlike crits. Instead, you must reach 102.4% avoidance in order to push crushing blows off of the boss's attack table and ensure that they never land. The formula is below. Warriors actually have the easiest time becoming uncrushable because they get 75% block chance from shield block. A boss with 2.0 or faster attack speed, or parry hasted boss, can potentially crush a warrior by eating both charges of their shield block before it is off CD. A warrior can reach passive uncrushability, aka not using their shield block, to gain threat, as they will no longer need to spend rage on shield block. This is in opposition to their shield competition, the Paladin, who has a much more difficult time becoming uncrushable, as Holy Shield only provides a 30% block baseline. Liberal Repentance is nearly mandatory for protection paladins and costs 15 badges of justice. The higher number of charges, however, makes them nearly immune to high attack speed or parry hasted bosses, and they are also far more unlikely to focus on passive uncrushability because they will gain more threat via spell power than additional avoidance. And this brings us to the Druid. Druids cannot easily obtain a method of getting uncrushable, and generally they won't. They cannot block or parry, so their avoidance is lower. However, they use their high armor and high HP pools to absorb these hits, and numerous bosses, which I have listed below, cannot crush. On these bosses, a Druid is gaining the most durability as compared to his competitors. So this is something to take in mind with Druid tanks. As I'm sure you're aware, tanks can die very fast, and therefore active mitigation is the ability to increase your damage reduction and restore health via consumables and activated abilities. The warrior has access to the largest amount of active mitigation cooldowns with Shield Wall, Last Stand, Super Healing Potion, and Master Healthstone. I include them because they can be used seamlessly by a warrior to increase their health in response to it dipping low. Additionally, they have Spell Reflection, which is very powerful, but it is also encounter specific. If there's no spell to spell reflect, then you aren't getting damage mitigation or threat off of it. Next up, we have the Paladin, and the Paladin retains the ability to use Super Healing Potions and Master Healthstones, much like the Warrior, though they don't have the same level of active mitigation cooldowns. In fact, it's fairly niche. Divine Shield cannot be used alongside Avenging Wrath. There's a 1-minute lockout on that, and it generally drops your threat. So the primary use of Divine Shield is to use it with a cancel aura macro, so you can hit the button and you can purge off an otherwise undispellable debuff like Sunder Armor or Mortal Strike, in addition to several other heavy damage boss mechanics. And lastly, we have the Druid, and the Druids have the least amount of active mitigation. They can technically use potions, but it's at a risk because they have to shift out of form. Barkskin triggers the GCD and therefore is not really used in combat, and is more of a pre-pull buff you can apply to yourself. And Frenzied Regeneration, while it does restore a good chunk of health, is not an instant save. It's 250 HP per second, which is nice, but it won't save you from being hit really hard several times in a row. So enough about taking less damage. How about letting everyone else deal more? That's why we're talking about threat. And to start off with the Warrior. Warriors generate threat through their abilities. They have flat values assigned to them that deal threat amounts. They do scale with damage, but less so than other tanks. They use defensive trinkets to increase their block value for Shield Slam in order to increase their threat, but lack a real threat boosting CD. Overall, the flat values are a bonus early on. This, combined with their gear flexibility, gives them very good single target threat. They do not have very good snap aggro or AoE threat, being limited to Thunderclap and Cleave, which can work but are harder to use than the other tanks' options. Overall, they offer very good, consistent single target threat especially over longer fights. They'll generally have to work harder in AoE and snap threat situations to match the performance of the other tanks, but that doesn't mean that they can't do it, it's just that they are not optimal in those circumstances. Next up, we have the Paladin, and Paladins generate threat through the use of damaging abilities with the option to fill rotation gaps with blessings. They have access to a potent threat CD, Avenging Wrath. Early on, their survivability gearing requirements will negatively impact their ability to generate threat. Once in better gear, they'll gain large amounts of threats from relatively small increases in spell power. This is why they're often considered bad single target tanks, because in order to tank those single target fights, they cannot gear as heavily into threat as compared to the other tanks. They also famously have the best AoE threat and very good range snap threat with Judgment, Avenger Shield, and Exorcism on the fight permitting. Overall, very high, best AoE threat, and eventually they will scale into being solid single target tanks with a focus on demons, undead, and bosses that attack quickly. Lastly, Druids. Druids are the Fury Warriors of TBC and generate threat through dealing physical damage. By virtue of their class mechanics, Druids can focus much more heavily on offensive stats, and therefore put out the best single target threat in the game. They do not have threat out CDs outside of trinkets, but they don't really need them. And while Druids do need to get good gear in order to become uncritable with good armor, all the hit expertise and crit they need for threat, once they attain that gear level, they just keep scaling hard with each upgrade. They're also the primary beneficiary of armor penetration in tier 6. They also offer very good snap threat with Mangle and decent AoE threat with Swipe. Overall, take a little bit to get off the ground, less than Paladins, but will provide highest single target threat, great snap threat, and okay AoE threat. And while not directly related to reducing damage taken or generating threat, utility is an important part of playing a tank, and each tank offers some unique utility. The warrior will generally not be providing this utility, but can in the circumstance where it's needed, including 2 of the better boss damage debuffs, and some other solid utility. Paladin, once again, will not often be providing these, but with some heads up play, you can save people with Blessing and Protection, and when you really need a cleanse, they are the tank that can provide it. And lastly, the Druid. Now, Mark of the Wild and Fairy Fire will almost certainly be provided by other raid members who have talented into improved versions. However, Leader of the Pack is a very solid buff for your group that increases your group's damage by a fair amount, especially for crit scaler. So what conclusions can we draw knowing all of this? Well, first I'd like to restate that tanks are all viable, but they have strengths and weaknesses which can make them more optimal for one encounter or raid tier, etc. So let's talk about those strengths and weaknesses. Well, the warrior, best spell mitigation, best active mitigation, solid single target threat, and useful utility. Their cons are that they don't scale as well with offensive stats compared to the other tanks, and they're less useful when not tanking, and they have bad AoE threat. Now, the Paladin has the best AoE threat, solid single target threat, high utility, and can flex healer. Their cons are a very slow start, and are mana reliant when they are off tank and between pulls, and their utility, specifically Blessing and Protection, Blessing and Freedom, Cleanse, require a lot of raid awareness in order to use them effectively. And lastly, we have the Druid. The Druid is the best single target threat, best physical mitigation, best snap threat, solid AoE threat, and can flex DPS. The cons to a Druid is that they will just sometimes die, and this is because with no active mitigation and inability to avoid crushing blows, they can be, crushed by RNG. Now, in TBC, this isn't as much an issue because you're not losing world buffs. It's just go next, try again, and the only other issue with Druids is that their utility is best covered by other specs. So, in conclusion, you really can play the tank that appeals to you most, and I hope this guide helped you. And thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Bye.